Storytelling has taken drastic leaps in the past century. Film has evolved from the silent cinema of the 1920s to the modern Marvel movies of the 2020s. Tales on the small screen went from janky Saturday morning serials to intense thrillers with intricate character development. Video games have gone from The Princess is in Another Castle to immersive, multi-layered narratives with rich lore. However, one form of media that has stayed more or less unchanged is the novel. Ever since Miguel de Cervantes published The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha in 1615, the prose novel has become the baseline against which all other forms of media are judged. The minimal resource commitment, a loner sitting in their writing bunker with pen and paper or keyboard on their lap, and the low cost of distribution sets up the novel as the prime medium for experimental storytelling, with many of the best or most financially successful stories being transformed into other forms of media. The diversification of mediums have helped to build interest in overarching aspects of the storytelling process, like world building, plot structure, world building, cliches and tropes, world building, hard versus soft magic systems that you should integrate into your world building, themes, and, world building. There is a plethora of discussion about these elements in nearly every book review on YouTube, and it's understandable why. Audiences like to know if a story has solid literary elements. However, this focus on the macro level of storytelling, especially in what I would like to term the summary review, where the review consists of a summary of the book followed by the subjective thoughts of the reviewer, has led to neglect for the minutiae of writing, especially when it comes to critical components like dialogue, descriptions, use of imagery, and the overall quality of the prose. Many of those elements are kind of glossed over with a quick take on whether the dialogue was cringe or the prose was bad. In books like 50 Shades of Grey, for example, we intuit that the prose is bad, but we just can't put our finger on why it is bad. As Harry Plinkett from Red Letter Media might say, you may not have noticed it, but your brain did. This series will try to explain that feeling we all get about bad books, with a focus on just why writing can sound bad, or cringy, or purple, or whatever, all while bringing in counterexamples of decent writing from decent authors. My plan is to analyze things line by line, taking you through the mistakes in prose that can, sink a story like my generation's career prospects. And to start off this series, I'll be going with True Allegiance, a thriller, which was written by conservative pundit and editor, I hope the emphasis there serves as foreshadowing for the rest of the series, of the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro. Now you might be wondering as to why I went with Ben Shapiro's book. The answer? Views and algorithm manipulation. The episode of the Joe Rogan Experience he is in has 16 million views, and some of the other interviews that he did have 11 million views. Other videos score easily in the million range. He's basically the most famous and controversial author on YouTube. So yeah, I'm not passing this opportunity up. Anyway, besides getting in good with the YouTube algorithm, Ben Shapiro has written some of the worst prose I've ever had the displeasure of reading. And it's worth discussing as an example of what not to do as a writer. Although the novel is only 5 hours long in audiobook format, it somehow manages to be both purple and underwritten at the same time. True Allegiance has run-on sentences, tonal dissonance, poor descriptions, and dialogue that would make you nostalgic for Jon Snow's lines in Season 8. However, the novel, if it can be called such a thing, has many errors in the prose that make the writing distinctly, uniquely bad. And you'll see some of those come up in this video. So this video will cover the prologue and chapter 1 of True Allegiance, although I do intend to go through every chapter of his book in this series. I will also rewrite some lines while providing counterexamples from better authors where needed. And also this will be a chronological criticism of the book with some broader comments on his writing style at the end of the video. And finally, a disclaimer on the politics in this book. Although this is a very politically charged book, I do not intend to make moral or ethical judgments or anything about that, about the themes, the characters, or anything else. I'm going in with the sole intent of demonstrating just how bad the writing is. So, prepare to partake in some constructive schadenfreude as we take a closer look at True Allegiance, Thriller by Ben Shapiro. So, we're going to be going through the purple prologue first. So here's a summary of the prologue. Just for context, this chapter is about how a mother named Jennifer and her daughter named Julie are caught on a bridge during a terrorist attack. They both die. Jennifer looked out at the sea of red lights before her, stretching all the way into New York, and sighed. There had to be 30,000 cars on this bridge, all of them moving 2 miles an hour. Jennifer glanced at her watch and sighed. Now, just for everybody in the audience here, this is the first paragraph in this book. Now, let's go on to the next slide. The bridge groaned. It was a loud, low groan that made the car vibrate. Julie woke up. "What was that?" she asked drowsily. The groan died away. "Nothing," said Jennifer. "Probably just a plane overhead. Go back to sleep." "Mommy?" The bridge groaned again. This time it was longer, more drawn out. Jennifer felt the brake pedal vibrate beneath her foot. Okay, so now these are some of the opening paragraphs in this book. It's fine to use the same word when it's the correct word, but this level of repetition in close proximity is bad. Especially the 1-2 double whammy of sighed, a character reaction, is too much, and it comes off as lazy writing. And if your characters are constantly sighing, maybe you should make your characters, stop sighing. You don't need to record every single goddamned expression they make like a polygraph machine, okay? And now onto the constant groans here. They should have been replaced with creak, or another verb that helps build sound imagery. He also continues this later on in his writing by using thousands repeatedly when describing the cars falling into the river below after the bridge falls. As Stephen King wrote in his memoir on writing, vocabulary is at the top of the writer's toolbox. It's a tool that all good writers should learn how to use, and it's clear that Mr. Shapiro just doesn't get it here. Okay, next slide. The bridge was undulating slightly up and down now. Let me read that again. The bridge was undulating slightly up and down now. This is an example of what I would like to term anxious prose. Undulating means having a smoothly rising and falling form or outline. That's the dictionary definition. So there's no need for the term, for the up and down at the end. It's repetitive, and it shows that the author is anxious about being understood. The only purpose up and down serves in that sentence is to show that the author isn't confident about his writing, and it makes the prose that much worse. Next slide. The noise of the traffic went silent. This is just bad. I'm just going to cite The Elements of Style, 4th edition by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White, Part 2-17, omit needless words. And I am rewriting this as the traffic grew silent. I think most people agree that that's much better. Okay, Jennifer screamed, but it was drowned out in the ear-splitting cracking noise. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel twisting and bending and grating on each other. The sound of 1 million airplanes all crashing at once. Okay, first off, this is a run-on sentence, and it's a sentence that really shows how less can be more. Twisting and bending and grating are all fine in themselves, but using 3, that's a bit much. It would have been better if this sentence had only used 2 of those words in there. And also, I would say that the airplane simile is fine, but the use of million is what makes it hyperbolic. And the hyperbole takes away from the tense and dramatic tone that Mr. Shapiro is trying to create, and it makes it more comedic. In fact, the only time when I can think of a million airplanes crashing at once being correct for a situation is something like a nuclear explosion. Really, that's the only time that I can think of that some sound can be compared to millions of airplanes crashing and having it not sound hyperbolic. Okay, next slide. Jennifer heard the awful roar, the unnatural screaming of thousands of voices as the stream of red lights before her began to disappear. There's no reason to attach unnatural to the screaming here. It makes the writing seem unnatural itself, since it's perfectly natural to scream when you're about to die. Yeah, that's just weird. So, miscellaneous thoughts about this prologue. There's poor word choice throughout. Most of the similes aren't well integrated into sentences, and it was as if they were tacked on at the very last moment. If you want to see an author that does similes well, read a Stephen King novel. And also, I would say that the visual imagery here was mediocre, but passable. It was passable. And with that, that is the beginning of the end of the nightmare. So, we are finally to Chapter 1, Brett. So, quick summary here. In this book's timeline, this chapter starts before the terrorist attack in the prologue. This chapter is all about Brett Hawthorne, a brigadier general in the U.S. Marine Corps and a certified badass. The chapter starts with him isolated in Kabul, Afghanistan. Then, it flashes back to when he was in Chicago High School with a bunch of African-American kids. Then, it flashes back to how he met his wife in college by paying her a lot of money for her paintings. Then, it flashes back to how he is this genius that learned Arabic and Pashto. Then, it flashes back to how he got promoted by this president that he doesn't like. Then, it flashes back to how he got deployed to Afghanistan. And then, finally, it flashes back to how he got stuck in the terrible situation he is currently in. So yeah, this chapter is flashbackception with exposition as the main course and a side of awful dialogue. So, let's get into the main course. This is the first sentence in this book. He was sat up against a mud brick hovel in the city's poor part of town. Even in Kabul, there was a large income gap, and felt the sweat trickle down cold between his shoulder blades. So this, right from the start, this is double plus on good. The first thing I need to say is that this is a run-on sentence, with the commentary about Kabul's income gap breaking the flow of the writing. Second, why did he use city's poor part of town instead of slums? It's not incorrect or slanderous to attribute the word slum to a war-torn place like Kabul. Slum is an honest term that describes the conditions there, and the phrasing city's poor part of town reads as an awkwardly phrased euphemism. Also, at the very end of the chapter, he does use slum to describe the part of Kabul that Hawthorne is in, so I have no idea why he went with this convoluted phrasing. Maybe he was self-censoring. Moving on. Tonal dissonance through description. This one's going to be a doozy. Hawthorne was a bear of a man. 6'3" in his bare feet and 215 pounds in his underwear, with a graying blonde crew cut and a face carved of granite. Okay, so let's forget about the bear of a man cliche for now, and go straight to the second part of the sentence. The 6'3" in his bare feet and 215 pounds in his underwear part. So for me, the thought of a big man in his underwear immediately brought Patrick Star to mind. I don't think that was the kind of mental image that Mr. Shapiro was going for, but the poor use of language evokes reactions like that from readers. This ends up disrupting the gritty tone that he was trying to create, specifically with the other imagery and descriptions he was setting up. So I circled everything on this page that helps to set a gritty, tense tone. The image of the empty pistol, the sound of Brett cursing, the mud brick hovel, the trickling sweat, the ominous, hellishly wrong, the face carved of granite. And then you get this landmine of a word that sneaks into the writing and single-handedly blows the tone to smithereens. It just doesn't fit the context of the rest of the page. It makes for a confused and jarring read. Also, as another point of criticism, Mr. Shapiro has a tendency to describe his characters in precise measurements, referring to an African-American high schooler later on as 6'5", clocked in at a solid 280 pounds later on in this chapter. This is problematic for a number of reasons. First, it comes off as mechanical and robotic. It's the kind of description you would expect to see read aloud during a murder trial. You know, the victim was a 173 centimeter tall Caucasian woman weighing 56 kilograms at the time of death. It's something that, sounds robotic and mechanical, right? Second, writing down numbers doesn't evoke anything. They leave very little for the imagination to grasp onto. Nobody looks at one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's photos as the Mr. Olympia and thinks he is 1.88 meters tall in his bare feet and 107 kilograms in his underwear. No, they think it's as if he's carved from marble, or he looks like a Greek god. While both of those lines are cliches, a writer should be trying to evoke similar reactions with their prose. And the third point is, you know how I just described the hypothetical murder victim and the governor in metric measurements? Did that throw a couple of my US viewers off? Maybe it made you want to Google kilograms to pounds or centimeters to inches. So, using US standard measurements in your writing is like doing that, but to 7 billion people instead of to 350 million. Writing like that can end up alienating your readers pointlessly because it forces them to do work that they shouldn't have to. So here's an excerpt from a Tom Clancy novel, The Hunt for Red October. It's in the same thriller genre, and in fact, it could be considered a grandfather of Mr. Shapiro's novel. The first chapter of the book opens similarly to the Brett chapter, with a physical description of Marco Ramius, a captain in the Soviet Navy. Captain First Rank Marco Ramius of the Soviet Navy was dressed for the Arctic conditions normal to the Northern Fleet submarine base at Polyarny. 5 layers of wool and oilskin enclosed him. So, I'll be the first to say that Tom Clancy is no Shakespeare. He is no Charles Dickens. He's none of those. He's not great at prose. The first sentence drags on for too long, and the verb envelops isn't great either. However, the description is short and to the point, and the layers upon layers of clothing help to evoke a sense of just how cold the Arctic climate is. The description isn't perfect, but it doesn't torpedo the tone like Shapiro's underwear. So, I rewrote Brett Hawthorne's description for Mr. Shapiro. I approached this process with 3 goals in mind. First, I want to eliminate bear of a man. The term is a cliche, plain and simple. Second, I want to tie his description to the context of the story, specifically how he is a U.S. Brigadier General serving in Kabul, one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Giving him a physical characteristic that binds him to the setting will enhance the gritty tone by immersing the reader. Third, I want to evoke something about Brett Hawthorne's character, even if it was something pretty simple. Get a hook into your audience. So here is the description. Brett Hawthorne was built like a castle underneath his Kevlar vest. Decades of service had forced granite-hard muscle to grow on his towering frame. The Brigadier General's sunburned face was coated in layers of grime, sweat, and dried blood. And beneath all of those layers, he wore a solemn grimace. A grimace for the citizens of Kabul. A grimace for his men. So, I wrote this at about 2 a.m. I went back and edited a little bit, but I think it turned out okay. It is longer than Mr. Shapiro's description, but I think that's warranted since Brett Hawthorne is a major character in this book. I use the simile built like a castle in this case because the image of a castle connotes righteousness stoutness, and moral conviction, all traits that Mr. Shapiro attempts to attribute to Brett Hawthorne, including the Kevlar vest. Kevlar is a synthetic fiber that bulletproof vests are woven out of. That helps to reinforce the image of physical sturdiness as well, and is also contextually relevant clothing. The grime, sweat, and dried blood, along with the solemn grimace, are meant to evoke a tense reaction. The two sentences at the very end, a grimace for the citizens of Kabul, a grimace for his men, is also there to foreshadow what happens later on in the story. Not that that part of the story is particularly well told. Okay, so we are finally finished with that description of Brett Hawthorne. Now, right after that, no joke, this paragraph follows right after the description of the Brigadier General. We get to this abomination of a scene. He looked up at the Hindu Kush. The city was romantically placed in full view of the mountain chain, a bizarre large cyst at the bottom of the grandiose peaks. The Kabul River, which once passed lazily through the city, slicing it in half and providing it with an anchor, had dried up to a series of puddles, leaving the city afloat on the steppes. Okay, so first, I'll comment on something that is okay. Okay, it's okay. The juxtaposition of the grandiose peaks and the bizarre large cyst, it wasn't bad. But if I were in Mr. Shapiro's position, I wouldn't have used a metaphor that evokes such a powerful sense of disgust. The bizarre large cyst. Okay, now I'll be getting on to one of the more unique errors that Mr. Shapiro made, and I would like to call it confusion through lack of description. The prose indicates that the city is both a bizarre large cyst at the bottom of the grandiose peaks and afloat on the steppes. Okay, so what does the city's geography actually look like? I can understand how it's possible for a city to be at the bottom of the Hindu Kush mountain chain and float on the steppes at the same time, but there is so little description to reinforce these contradictory images that it ends up becoming very, very confusing for the reader. An author who is dedicated to detail, Robert Jordan, for example, could have pulled off a complex, multifaceted description of a city like that. However, doing that would require paragraphs upon paragraphs of precise and engaging prose that paints a concrete mental image for the reader. And since True Allegiance is less than half the length of the shortest book in the Wheel of Time series, Mr. Shapiro shouldn't be dedicating time to a description like that anyway. Honestly, he should have just cut out this description of Kabul's geography and focused on other parts of the setting, like the shattered condition of the city's infrastructure, or the eerie screams of the citizens in the background. Okay, so there's a section where Mr. Shapiro writes about Brett Hawthorne and how he was involved in this incident in high school with some African-American football player named Yard. Okay, he's not named Yard, he's called Yard. That's his nickname. So, Yard thought that Brett called Yard the N-word. And then another black kid named Derek walks over and says that he called the football player the N-word instead, and that it wasn't Brett who called him the N-word. And then they start singing some strange racial kumbaya song. So I'll read it out while censoring where need be, because this is an example of atrocious dialogue. Then Yard mumbled something in his face. "What?" said Brett. "I said," Yard growled, "did you just call me the N-word? Because I just heard you call me the N-word." The entire room turned to watch the impending carnage. Yard's hand came down on Brett's shoulder, heavy as doom. Brett could feel his bowels begin to give way when a smallish hand emerged on Yard's shoulders. A black hand. Yard swiveled ponderously to face down the person connected with the hand. A small person, slim, wearing glasses and a wide smile across his face. "Yard man." he said. "He didn't call you the N-word." "What you talking about, Derek?" rumbled Yard. "It was me, man. I called you the N-word." Yard looked puzzled. "No," he said slowly. "It was the white boy." "Oh yeah, man?" said Derek. "It was. I'm white. You just mixed us up." He moved around to stand next to Brett. "See? We're twins. Identical. Anybody could mix us up, even though I'm more handsome." Yard's eyes glazed over with confusion. The giggling started at the back of the room. Yard's hands clenched and unclenched as the wave rose over the room until the kids were slapping each other on the back. Yard's fists closed tight. But as they did, Derek leaned forward, reached out, and lightly tapped Yard's hands, and then started singing at the top of his lungs that Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder song, "Ebony and Ivory." "Come on, sing with me, Yard. You be ebony, I'll be ivory." But Yard was backing away now, a look on his face asking, "Who is this nut job?" Derek turned to Brett and continued singing. So dialogue needs to flow, and lines like, "Oh, yeah, man," and "See, we're twins, identical, anybody could mix us up, even though I'm more handsome," those are choppy. The only character that I actually like here is Yard. He's the only character I have any sympathy for, because regardless of Mr. Shapiro's motives or thought processes behind the character, the integration of African-American vernacular English into Yard's voice with "What you talking about, Derek?" instead of "What are you talking about, Derek?" helps to make his voice stand out. And the confusion that he shows is the exact same reaction that any reader would have to this awkward spectacle. So yeah, Yard is the only person who I have any sort of sympathy for in this scene. Okay, so next part. The coaches had ignored him in high school, but at the Citadel, he quickly became their favorite. He didn't pick the college because of its military background. He picked it because he read a Pat Conroy book, and because South Carolina seemed gothic and romantic compared to the south side of Chicago. So, this passage is about why Brett Hawthorne chose the college that he did. And it's a perfectly terrible use of illusion with the use of the Pat Conroy book. Whenever you allude to another text, you need to evoke a specific element from the text. Otherwise, the readers who haven't read that text are going to be left in the dark. Allusions should be like Easter eggs in video games. Little treats to people who know what you're talking about, and inconsequential for those who don't. In this case, the Pat Conroy book, a book that we don't even get a title for, serves as half of Brett's reasoning for choosing the college that he went to. The other half, South Carolina seemed gothic and romantic compared to the south side of Chicago, could have been good if it was handled competently. However, this juxtaposition is too nebulous and vague, with no examples given and only a hint of emotional imagery. So, this is going to be great. This is the part where Brett meets his future wife, Ellen. Just for context, she's selling paintings at a nearby shopping area, and Brett is stopping by and looking at her wares. Brett didn't care about that. He turned, irked, and found himself face to face with a beautiful young woman, about 17, staring aggressively at him. So this is just blatant adverb abuse. Change aggressively to menacingly. Better yet, change staring to glaring and eliminate the adverb. Okay, so this is my favorite part of the book. This is the part where Brett romances Ellen. My condolences go out to the Audible narrator who had to read this aloud, even if he didn't get paid for it. No, she said. I expected better from a cadet. Hanging around here, driving away all the customers? Ellen's Southern, by the way. And what if I do drive them all away? What if I was the last man left on Earth, standing right here at this shop? He couldn't believe his mouth was moving this well, considering his tongue had turned to glue against his molders. Would you do me the honor of letting me take you for a walk along the pier? He flashed what he hoped was his most charming smile. I've been asked by cadets before, and I'll be asked by cadets again. She shot back without hesitation. And you'll wipe that grin that looks like you're eating tacks and manure off your face? And if you buy one of these here pictures, I'll think about it. The smile disappeared. His hand flashed to his wallet. He took out a $20 bill, fingered it, then handed it over, pointing at a watercolor palmetto-lined road along the shore. Pointing at a watercolor of a palmetto-lined road along the shore. Sorry. I'll take that one. She handed it over. So, how about it? She raised an eyebrow in mockery. No, I think I'll pass. He felt the frustration rise in his chest. But I just bought the picture. I'm not that cheap of a date, she laughed. This time the musicality of it pierced him. So maybe his way with words didn't win Ellen, but his persistence did. By the time he bought his 5th picture, she agreed to a walk. By the 10th, they were going steady. 2 years later, they were married. Okay, so this is an example of how poor dialogue can ruin characterization. Brett says, and I'm going to repeat this I'm going to repeat this just for emphasis. And what if I do drive them away? What if I was the last man left on Earth, standing here right at this shop? This makes Brett sound pathetic. Brett is supposed to be a buff, badass military cadet. And here he is talking like an edgy weirdo straight out of a shonen anime. Now, I get it. He's right out of high school and probably doesn't have a lot of experience with the relationships. And that's fine. In fact, it actually gives him a modicum of relatability. However, Ellen's reaction to this awkward guy is to laugh, go on a date, and eventually marry the guy. And while I promise not to comment on the content of the story, the idea of getting married to a woman that you needed to pay for walks along the pier is really, really dumb. Ellen makes it pretty clear that she has met many cadets from the military academy before, which could indicate that she has been paid many times for walks along the pier before. So, putting this in modern terms, this is like a female streamer getting married to a guy who super chatted her 50 grand on Twitch. It could conceivably happen, but it's no grounds for a sustainable relationship. Yeah. So, moving on. This is where Ellen gets pregnant, but then miscarries. Or does she? It's hard to tell, and you'll see why. She also told him she was pregnant. For the first time since Iraq, she saw the light come back into his eyes. Okay, he finally told her. When the baby is born, I'll let them know. The timing works out just right. Then he kissed her, felt the softness of her lips, and knew everything would be all right. 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night, Ellen woke him, screaming. Her voice cracked as it reached the apex. Shrieks over and over in the night. Blood on the sheets, her hands clawing at her face. He picked her up in his powerful arms, held her tight, so small against him. He rushed her to the car, foot to the floorboard, one hand gripping hers, and her hand gripping his so tight he thought she might break his fingers. Afterwards, the doctors told them children were out of the question. Okay, so, what the hell just happened? As a reader, I can't tell because there's too little information in this text. The prose keeps on going on about how he is gripping her and she is gripping him. Yet again, that word choice right there. But the lack of visual imagery leaves the reader wondering about what exactly happened to Ellen. If it's just blood on the sheets, screaming, and hands clawing at her face, I can't tell what exactly happened to her. Was she shot? Did she drink bleach? Did she get destroyed by facts and logic, epic style? I have no goddamn clue of what's going on. So the only thing that implies that it was a miscarriage is the bottom line about doctors and children being out of the question, But then again, the prose is too vague about what caused this. So, in this case, either Mr. Shapiro should have A, stated outright that this was a miscarriage, or B, used vivid, gory imagery about clumps of baby flesh and bits of malformed placenta oozing out of her vagina. And, yeah, I get it. B is pretty nasty, but it's totally appropriate in the context of this book. I mean, it's a thriller meant for adult audiences who should be able to handle stuff like that. There's murder, violence, burning cities, children being blown to bits, and tons of terrorist attacks. Not to mention the swearing and the aforementioned use of racial slurs. So yeah, it's appropriate. And the vagueness is just not good. So, this next line is about how Brett is useful to the U.S. government in Afghanistan. And this is about how he can speak Pashto and Arabic and different languages. I forgot what exactly the language was, but is what makes him useful to the U.S. government. That little fact made him one of the first men on the ground in Afghanistan. He knew little of the country's culture, but his knowledge of the language made him a valuable commodity. So this is a simple fix. Swap commodity with asset. The former implies that he is going to be sold off like corn or soybeans, while the latter indicates that he is reusable, because assets are reusable. So next. This is a passage likening Brett's experience in Afghanistan to the movie Lawrence of Arabia. It was all very Lawrence of Arabia, Brett thought, except that Peter O'Toole never had to deal with roadside bombs or donkeys laden with explosives or the lure of the opium trade. And T.E. Lawrence hadn't missed his wife, either, of course, and he missed Ellen. Now, Lawrence of Arabia has a number of historical inaccuracies. However, nowhere in the film is there any mention of T.E. Lawrence having a wife. In fact, guess what most historians think T.E. Lawrence's sexual orientation was? Gay. Yeah. Also, he was probably a masochist. He probably, by modern standards, he would have enjoyed CBT. Yeah, so why are you saying, Mr. Shapiro, that T.E. Lawrence hadn't missed his wife either, of course, when he had no wife to miss? That's a basic factual mistake that is unique to this book. He might not have intended for the reader to take it that way, but that means his prose is just that bad. It's that confusing. Yeah, it's so confusing that it creates historical inaccuracies. Okay, so next. For context, this is about how a bunch of Marines need to escape by jumping off the top of a building after they are ambushed by terrorists. And this is getting on into the part where where the exposition is going through how Brett got into this terrible situation that he is in. The thought flashed across his mind that the Pentagon would be beside itself knowing it had a general officer in a close-quarter battle. Then he thought that Prescott probably wouldn't care. Prescott is the president that he doesn't like, by the way. So long as it didn't make too much news. Brett didn't have time to think about what he did next. He just did it. So this shows that the novel has no sense of tone or tension, precisely because Brett is going through an entire dialectical thought process before he, quote, just acts. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis in this little segment right here. And this is while the Marines are trying to jump off a building rooftop, okay? Right when they're getting ambushed by terrorists. It doesn't work. None of this works. Okay, so this is the same part. This is the part where the Marines are jumping off the building rooftops. This is very close to the last slide. One of the men landed awkwardly, and he shrieked as his ankle cracked. The other Marines silenced him. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to read that out again. One of the men landed awkwardly, and he shrieked as his ankle cracked. The other Marines silenced him. So, how does that sound to you? It sounds nice and euphemistic, because simply silencing somebody is a euphemism for killing them. Yeah, so that's terrible. Okay, next part. This is the very end of the chapter, and I'm so glad that I'm finally gotten through this. It had been 3 hours. Rhett sat in another alleyway in the slums of the town, separated from his men, if any of them were still alive, listening to the silence of a city at peace, a city in the enemy's hands. So, how is a city in the enemy's hands a city at peace from Brett Hawthorne's perspective? When it's just occupied, right? That's all it is, right? Okay, so we're getting on into the end of chapter thoughts. There's still tons of passive voice use. The adverb abuse continues. And there's plenty of awkward sentences where there's 4 commas in a row. Like, there's a bit of writing, comma, a bit of writing, comma, 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 and it makes all the sentences very choppy and hard to read. And back to the plot. The plot is exposition upon exposition about Brett Hawthorne's life, and I don't care about Brett Hawthorne really, because his life seems pretty boring. And this is a miscellaneous structural issue that I need to tack on at the very end, similar to how Mr. Shapiro likes to tack on his similes. Mr. Shapiro has a tendency to include these one-sentence paragraphs after bits of dialogue or long paragraphs, and it's way overdone. Then, Mark Prescott was elected president. Then, all at once, things changed. Then, Colonel Brett Hawthorne saved the day. I found these one-sentence paragraphs on basically every page. These are great and good thrillers because they grip the audience and makes them want to continue reading. But Mr. Shapiro uses them so often that it becomes boring. A couple more examples. And he rose. Then Prescott called. I think this is another example of the anxious prose that I mentioned earlier, because if you think you need to keep gripping your audience with these dramatic one-line sentences over and over and over again to get them to keep reading your book, maybe you should reconsider the story. Maybe it's just not that gripping in the first place. Here's a couple more examples. That was last January. They were right. If you need to keep doing this, maybe you should go back and rewrite it, just like all good authors do, instead of constantly reassuring yourself by saying, okay, this is epic. So, in conclusion, the prose is bad. And a friendly reminder to everybody still watching, we're still only on chapter 1.